How the most wanted spy in France had only one real leg. Lyon, France. November 1942. Klaus Barbie sits at his desk in the Gestapo headquarters on the Rue Sainte-Foy and stares at a file that is almost completely empty. For 14 months, his agents have been hunting the same person. They know she is a woman. They know she walks with a limp. They know she is dismantling German operations across southern France from the inside. They know nothing else. Not her name, not her nationality, not where she sleeps, not what she looks like. Barbie has personally tortured dozens of resistance fighters trying to extract this information. Some told him everything they knew, which turned out to be nothing useful. Others died saying nothing at all. The file stays empty. And somewhere in his city, the woman walks free. He writes a note to his superiors that will later be found in captured German records. The woman who limps is one of the most dangerous Allied agents in France. We must find and destroy her. He does not know her name is Virginia Hall. He does not know she is American. He thinks she is Canadian. He is wrong about almost everything, except one thing. She is the most dangerous Allied agent in France. That part is exactly correct. To understand how a one-legged American woman from Baltimore ended up at the top of the Gestapo's most wanted list, you have to go back 9 years to a hunting trip in Turkey that went catastrophically wrong, and to a decision Virginia Hall made in the hospital afterward that tells you everything about who she was. Virginia Hall was born in 1906 into a wealthy Baltimore family. By her mid-20s, she spoke French, German, Italian, and Russian. Her goal was straightforward. She wanted to be an American diplomat, not a secretary, a diplomat. She applied to the State Department. They gave her a clerical position in Warsaw and later transferred her to Smyrna, Turkey. She took it without complaint because she understood the game. You get inside first, then you build from there. In December 1933, she went on a hunting trip outside the city. While climbing over a fence, she slipped. Her shotgun discharged. The bullet hit her left foot. The wound became infected, and the infection spread faster than the doctors could manage. Surgeons amputated her left leg below the knee. She was 27 years old. What happened next is the part that matters. Virginia Hall woke up in a Turkish hospital, looked at where her leg used to be, asked the nurse for paper, and began writing a letter requesting reassignment. She named the prosthetic wooden leg they fitted her with Cuthbert, as if it were a difficult colleague rather than a permanent disability. Then she went back to work. She spent the next 6 years trying to become a diplomat. She reapplied to the State Department multiple times, each time with better language skills, more experience, stronger recommendations. Each time, the answer came back the same. The State Department had a rule: individuals with physical disabilities could not serve as diplomatic officers. The Secretary of State himself reviewed her final appeal and sent back a single sentence. Hall could become a fine career girl in the consular service. She would not be a career girl. In March 1939, she resigned. 3 months later, Germany invaded Poland. The world she had spent 15 years preparing to serve diplomatically was burning. Virginia Hall was in Europe when the invasion happened. She volunteered to drive ambulances for the French army, hauling wounded men through roads clogged with refugees as the German advance collapsed the front. When France fell in June 1940, she made her way to London. She had no plan beyond one conviction: the war needed fighting, and she intended to fight it. In London, she met a British officer connected to an organisation Churchill had just created with a single instruction: set Europe ablaze. The Special Operations Executive, the SOE, existed to do what conventional armies could not. It inserted agents into occupied territory to build resistance networks, sabotage German operations, move downed pilots to safety, and feed intelligence back to London. It was illegal under the laws of war. It was extraordinarily dangerous. 40% of SOE's female agents sent into France did not survive. They were caught, tortured and executed, or sent to concentration camps where they were worked to death. The British officer looked at Virginia Hall's file: fluent French, extensive knowledge of France, American citizenship, meaning she was technically a neutral, and a personality that projected nothing memorable, nothing threatening. A woman a German checkpoint officer would wave through without a second thought. He recruited her on the spot. Nobody in the room raised the question of the prosthetic leg. Virginia did not raise it either. The SOE trained her in weapons handling, dead drops, radio transmission, counter-surveillance and resistance recruitment. In August 1941, they gave her a press credential identifying her as a correspondent for the New York Post and put her on a train to Lyon. Her stated mission was economic and political reporting. She was the SOE's first female operative sent into France. Lyon was not a safe posting. It sat in the German Allied Vichy zone of France, geographically constrained by rivers, with limited exit routes that made it easy to seal. The Gestapo maintained a heavy presence there and had informants woven into every layer of civilian life. Agents who stayed too long in Lyon had a habit of disappearing. Within 6 weeks of arrival, Virginia Hall had built a network of 90 agents across southern France. She called it the Heckler Network. It had informants inside German administrative offices, doctors running safe houses disguised as medical facilities, couriers moving intelligence across city lines, and escape routes for downed Allied airmen running all the way to the Spanish border. She transmitted encrypted intelligence to London through a chain of dead drops and relay contacts that made her own location nearly impossible to trace. She was also filing fake articles to her New York Post cover, attending German organized social events to gather information, and running the entire operation while sharing a city with Klaus Barbie, who at that moment was building a reputation as one of the most effective and brutal Gestapo commanders in occupied France. Barbie would ultimately be responsible for deporting 7,500 Jews and resistance fighters to concentration camps and personally executing 4,000 others. He was not incompetent. He was not someone you wanted hunting you. By early 1942, Barbie knew he had a serious problem. Resistance activity in Lyon was accelerating. German operations were being compromised. His informants were being fed false information. Somebody was organizing this. His agents eventually produced a description: a woman, foreign, walks with a limp. Barbie had wanted posters printed and distributed to every checkpoint, hotel, and administrative office in the region. The posters did not include a name because nobody knew her name. They did not include a photograph because nobody had seen her clearly. They described only the limp and carried a single line of instruction that was distributed to every Gestapo unit in southern France, the enemy's most dangerous spy: find her and destroy her. Virginia Hall saw one of the posters. She later told a colleague it was the first time she felt genuinely flattered by her work. By September 1942, she transmitted a message to London that her time was almost up. The Gestapo's dragnet was tightening. Agents she had recruited were being arrested. Each arrest meant interrogation, which meant torture, which meant names. She had perhaps weeks before someone who knew enough broke under pressure. She could not wait for London to extract her. London had no way to extract her. She would have to get out herself. The only route that made sense was south through the Pyrenees into Spain, on foot, in November. 44 miles through mountain terrain that rose to 7,500 feet before descending into Spain. In conditions where today, travel guides specifically warn against attempting the crossing in November. Virginia Hall began the crossing on a trail used by resistance fighters, accompanied by 2 companions. At some point during the march, in the cold and the dark and the altitude, she sent a radio transmission to SOE headquarters in London. The message read, "Cuthbert is giving me trouble." She meant her prosthetic leg was failing in the mountain conditions. The SOE officer on duty in London, apparently unfamiliar with her code name for the prosthetic, transmitted back a response that would become one of the more absurd communications of the entire war. "If Cuthbert is giving you trouble, have him eliminated." She kept walking. Пишу переработанную вторую главу. The woman who crossed the Pyrenees on a wooden leg arrived in Spain and was immediately arrested. Spanish border police detained Virginia Hall the moment she descended from the mountains into the town of San Juan de las Abadesas. But before we get to the arrest, you need to understand what it actually took to reach that point, because the crossing itself is the part that tells you who Virginia Hall really was. November in the Pyrenees means temperatures that drop below freezing after sunset, trails that disappear under ice, and terrain that rises to over 7,000 feet before it comes back down. The route Virginia Hall took was used by resistance fighters and escaped prisoners moving between France and Spain. It was not a path. It was a series of landmarks memorized in advance through forest and rock and snowfield, navigated in darkness to avoid German patrols on the French side and Spanish border guards on the other. She walked it in 3 days. Her prosthetic leg was a wooden and leather construction designed for flat surfaces. On mountain terrain, on ice, on loose rock descending steep grades in the dark, it became something else entirely. The stump of her left leg, the skin and tissue pressed against the socket of the prosthetic with every step, began to blister within the first hours. By the second day, the blisters had opened. By the third day, she was walking on raw flesh inside a wooden cup, in the cold, at altitude, with no option to stop. At some point during the crossing, she managed to transmit a brief radio message to SOE headquarters in London. The message said, "Cuthbert is giving me trouble." She meant the prosthetic leg was failing. The SOE duty officer, apparently unaware that Cuthbert was her name for the leg, transmitted back a response that became one of the stranger communications of the entire war. "If Cuthbert is giving you trouble, have him eliminated." Virginia Hall read the message, put the radio away, and kept walking. She crossed into Spain on the third morning. The Spanish border police arrested her within the hour. This is the part that is almost impossible to process. She had just crossed a mountain range in winter on a wooden leg with an open wound, while the Gestapo was hunting her across an entire country. She had made it. And the first thing that happened on the other side was handcuffs and a cell in the Figueres prison. The Spanish guards confiscated her bags. Inside was an encrypted radio codebook, the kind of document that, in the wrong hands, would burn every network she had spent 15 months building in France and put dozens of people directly in front of a Gestapo firing squad. Virginia Hall asked for a moment of privacy for personal reasons. The guard, dealing with what appeared to be an exhausted middle-aged woman, stepped outside. She spent the next 2 hours methodically destroying the codebook page by page, committing every code to memory as she went. When the guard returned, there was nothing left. Every operational code that had existed on paper now existed only inside her head. She spent 6 weeks in that Spanish prison. The American consulate in Barcelona worked through diplomatic channels to secure her release, a process that moved with the speed of wartime bureaucracy, which is to say, extremely slowly. She was released in January 1943 with no documents, no equipment, and no codebook. She did not need the codebook. She had memorized it. She arrived in London the same month. SOE debriefed her for weeks. Her intelligence on German troop positions, Gestapo operational methods, and resistance network structures across southern France was described by her handlers as the most detailed and operationally useful information they had received from any agent in the field. She had built a network of 90 agents, moved dozens of downed Allied airmen to safety, and transmitted intelligence that directly affected Allied planning, all from inside a city where Klaus Barbie had been actively trying to find her for over a year. SOE offered her a desk position in London. She declined. She wanted to go back into France. Read that again. She had just crossed a mountain range in winter on a bleeding stump. She had been imprisoned. She had been hunted for 15 months by the most feared secret police in occupied Europe. And her response to all of that was, "Send me back." There was a practical reason alongside the personal one. By early 1943, the Allied invasion of France was no longer a question of whether, but when. When it came, the difference between success and catastrophe would depend on how organised the French resistance was, how many German supply routes had been disrupted, how much the Allies knew about garrison strengths and troop positions. Virginia Hall was one of perhaps a dozen people alive who had the language, the networks, the operational experience, and the personal contacts to build that foundation from inside. She knew it. SOE knew it. And Klaus Barbie's wanted posters were still on walls across France with a description that matched her exactly. So she changed everything. She spent months with SOE disguise specialists. They dyed her hair grey, then white. They used prosthetic facial padding to reshape her jaw and cheekbones. They taught her to alter her posture, to round her shoulders and bend forward, to move with the deliberate slowness of a French peasant woman who had lived in mountain villages her entire life. The limp she already had from the prosthetic, which had always been a liability, now became part of the disguise. She did not hide it. She leaned into it. An old woman who walks slowly with a limp is invisible in rural France. Nobody looks at her twice. She also trained to transmit radio messages in Morse code fast enough to compress an entire report into under 30 seconds. German direction-finding units, the teams driving converted trucks that triangulated transmissions, needed roughly 45 seconds to get a precise fix on a stationary signal. Every second under that threshold was the difference between another day alive and a Gestapo team kicking in a door. In March 1944, a fishing boat eased toward the French coastline in darkness. An elderly peasant woman climbed over the side into shallow water and waded ashore with a battered suitcase. She moved slowly, hunched, completely unremarkable. A German patrol passed within 200 metres of the landing point. The soldiers did not look at her. Virginia Hall was back in France. The Gestapo's most wanted Allied agent had just walked back into the country that was trying to kill her, dressed as a woman 30 years older than herself, on a leg made of wood, 14 months after barely escaping with her life. Her new identity was Marcelle Montagne. Her cover was a French milkmaid in the Haute-Loire, a remote region of mountains and deep valleys in central France that had become a stronghold of resistance activity. Every morning she rose before dawn and drove a small herd of goats across the hillsides surrounding the village of Maidou. This was not innocent countryside work. As she moved the goats, she was surveilling the entire area, counting German vehicles at checkpoints, mapping patrol patterns and timing, identifying flat fields long enough for nighttime parachute drops of weapons and supplies from Allied aircraft, recording the locations of every bridge, rail junction, communications line, and fuel depot within operating range. German soldiers stopped her regularly at checkpoints. A limping old woman with a herd of goats was precisely what they expected to see. They checked her forged documents and waved her through. On multiple occasions, German soldiers helped load her supply bags onto her cart, without knowing they were handling material belonging to the OSS operative their commanders had been hunting for 3 years. There was one checkpoint she passed through so regularly that a young German corporal began recognizing her. He would nod as she approached. Sometimes he held the gate open without checking her papers. He thought she was a harmless old farmer, She was transmitting his unit's patrol schedule to London twice a week. She was not lucky. She was precise. Every detail of the disguise, every movement, every interaction at every checkpoint had been rehearsed and thought through until it was instinct. But precision has limits, and Virginia Hall was operating in a country where the Gestapo had informants in every village, where a single wrong word to the wrong person ended everything. The invasion she was preparing for was weeks away. The work was not finished. And somewhere in Lyon, Klaus Barbie still had her description on his desk. June 5th, 1944. 11:47 in the evening. A farmhouse in the Haute-Loire region of central France. Virginia Hall is sitting alone at a kitchen table in complete darkness. She does not light a lamp because a lamp in a window at midnight draws attention, and attention is the one thing she cannot afford. On the table in front of her is a compact radio transmitter. Next to it is a handwritten list of coordinates, patrol schedules, and garrison positions that she has spent the last 3 days verifying on foot with a herd of goats, while German soldiers waved her through checkpoints without looking at her face. 20 minutes ago, the BBC broadcast its evening programme to occupied France. Inside the regular programming, between music and news, the announcer read a line of poetry. That specific line was the prearranged signal her network had been waiting for. It meant the invasion was beginning. It meant everything she had built over the past 3 months was now activated. It meant tonight. She picks up the radio key and begins transmitting. Her fingers move fast. Under 30 seconds per message. She has practiced this until it is purely mechanical, because at 31 seconds a German direction-finding truck gets a fix, and men with rifles are on their way. The message contains the positions of 3 German garrisons, the route of a supply convoy moving through the region the following morning, and the coordinates of 4 road junctions she has confirmed are undefended. She finishes, disconnects the antenna, wraps the radio in oilcloth and slides it back under the floorboard. Then she goes to her window and looks out at the dark French countryside and thinks about what is happening right now on the other side of the horizon. Hundreds of aircraft crossing the channel, thousands of young men dropping into the dark, ships beyond counting moving through the water toward the beaches. And here, 300 miles inland, one woman in a farmhouse who has spent 3 months making sure that when those men reach the shore, the Germans waiting for them would be distracted, delayed, and partially blind. She goes to sleep. She has a great deal of work to do in the morning. What happened in the Haute-Loire in the weeks following D-Day was not an accident, and it was not spontaneous. It was the result of 3 months of precise, patient preparation by a single person operating under a false identity with a prosthetic leg and a grey wig. Virginia Hall had 400 resistance fighters under her coordination. She had organised them into independent cells so that the arrest of any one group could not expose the others. She had supplied them with weapons delivered by parachute into the fields she had identified during her goat surveys. She had mapped every bridge, rail junction, telephone line, and fuel depot in the region, and assigned specific targets to specific units, with timing coordinated so that multiple strikes would hit simultaneously, before the Germans could understand what was happening and respond. On the morning of June 7th, a German supply convoy moving north toward Normandy turned onto a road that had existed the previous day. The road now ended at a destroyed bridge. While the convoy sat immobile trying to find an alternate route, fighters from Hall's network hit it from both sides. The convoy was destroyed. The supplies never reached Normandy. That same morning, in 3 separate locations across the region, rail lines were cut. Not damaged. Cut, with explosive charges placed precisely at points that would take the longest to repair. German repair crews who arrived at the first site found the second site had been destroyed while they were working on the first. German commanders in the region sent increasingly desperate messages to their superiors describing coordinated sabotage activity across the entire area. The messages used phrases like systematic and clearly pre-planned. They were correct on both counts. By the end of the first week, Hall's network had killed or captured over 1,000 German soldiers and destroyed 19 locomotives. 3 separate German battalions that had been ordered to reinforce units fighting on the Normandy beaches were still sitting in the Haute-Loire because the roads and rail lines they needed to use had ceased to exist. Each of those battalions represented thousands of men who did not arrive at the beach during the critical first 72 hours, when the Allied foothold in France was at its most fragile. Post-war Allied assessments would later confirm what those numbers meant. The margin of success at Normandy was not comfortable. The German counterattack in the first 3 days came closer to pushing the invasion back into the sea than most histories acknowledge. Every battalion delayed mattered. Every supply convoy destroyed mattered. Virginia Hall's network was responsible for a significant portion of that disruption in her region, and she had built it alone, on a wooden leg, while the Gestapo hunted her. Then the war ended. Virginia Hall came out of the field in the autumn of 1944 and reported to the OSS headquarters in Paris. She was 38 years old. She had been running active operations in occupied France for 3 years, with almost no interruption. She had built 2 separate networks from nothing. She had crossed the Pyrenees on a bleeding stump. She had come back under a false identity and coordinated the resistance campaign that helped hold the door open for D-Day. She sat down at a desk in Paris and began writing her operational reports. That image is worth holding for a moment. The most effective Allied agent in France, the woman Klaus Barbie had spent 3 years trying to identify and had never once come close to finding, sitting in a chair in a Paris office writing reports that her superiors would read, file, and largely forget. The OSS recommended her for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest combat decoration the United States awards. General William Donovan personally endorsed the recommendation. The citation was specific and unambiguous about what she had done. President Truman was asked to present the medal at a public ceremony. Virginia Hall said no. She was not being modest. She was being a professional. The war in Europe was over, but the Cold War was already beginning, and she intended to go back into the field. A public ceremony meant press photographers. Press photographers meant her real face attached to her real name in publications that Soviet intelligence services read as carefully as anyone. She had spent 3 years being invisible. She was not going to burn that now for a photograph. The presentation took place in a private office. General Donovan, Virginia Hall, and no one else. He handed her the Distinguished Service Cross. She accepted it. The ceremony lasted approximately 15 minutes. She was the only civilian woman to receive that decoration in the entire Second World War, and virtually no one outside that room knew it happened. The OSS was dissolved 2 months later. Truman shut it down in September 1945. Virginia Hall found herself without an organization, and the institution that stepped into the gap was the State Department, the same State Department that had rejected her diplomatic application in 1939 because she had a wooden leg. They gave her a clerical position processing intelligence reports. She did not complain. She filed the reports and waited. In 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency was created. She applied immediately and was hired as an operations officer. She spent the next 15 years running agents and intelligence networks during the early Cold War. In the same way, she had always worked quietly, without recognition, producing results that her superiors benefited from and rarely attributed to her directly. The CIA's internal culture in the 1950s was not generous to women who wanted operational roles. She fought for every assignment. She took what she could get and made it work. She retired in 1966 when agency regulations required it at age 60. She had not wanted to retire. There was a small internal ceremony. A few colleagues attended. There were no photographs. She moved to a farm in Maryland and spent the next 16 years gardening, raising animals, and living a life that bore no visible relationship to anything she had done between 1941 and 1966. Neighbours knew her as a quiet, private woman who kept to herself. She died in 1982. She was 76 years old. Her obituary in the local paper ran 4 sentences. Now here is the part that should make you genuinely angry. In 2016, 34 years after her death, the CIA named a training facility after her. In 2022, 80 years after she built her first network in Lyon, Congress awarded her the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The medal was accepted by her surviving relatives. Virginia Hall had been dead for 40 years. Klaus Barbie, the man who spent 3 years hunting her, was captured by American intelligence officers in 1946. In a decision that remains one of the more difficult chapters of post-war American intelligence history, the Army Counterintelligence Corps then used him as an informant for several years, apparently valuing his knowledge of European communist networks more than his record of torturing and killing French civilians. He was eventually helped to flee to Bolivia under a false identity, where he lived undisturbed for 25 years as Klaus Altmann. A Nazi hunter identified him in 1971. He was extradited to France in 1983, tried for crimes against humanity, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in his cell in 1991. He died without ever learning the name of the woman he had been hunting. The agent he had called the enemy's most dangerous spy, the woman whose description had been on wanted posters across southern France for 3 years, had operated within his reach the entire time, and he had never once gotten close. Not in Lyon, not during the crossing of the Pyrenees, not in the Haute-Loire, where she had come back under a disguise and spent 3 months preparing the campaign that greeted his army on the morning after D-Day. There is a photograph in the CIA archives taken of Virginia Hall sometime in the early 1940s. She is looking directly into the camera. She looks entirely unremarkable. A woman you would walk past on a street without registering. A woman a German soldier at a checkpoint would wave through without a second glance. A woman whose face meant nothing unless you already knew what she had done with it. That was not an accident. That was the work. And for most of the 80 years since she did it, almost nobody knew her name. Now you do.